idea.
I'll stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
Dead Space 2 is one of the best examples of what a sequel should be. It follows the blueprint that was laid down by the original Dead Space, fixes most of its flaws, expands on the framework of its predecessor. This is my first time playing Dead Space 2, and overall I feel it's better than the original. It's one of the best games to have been released in 2011, a year that saw a number of high-quality releases. The stakes are higher, the plot is more personal, it's bigger and more bombastic, but it doesn't lose the heart and soul of what Dead Space is. It's still got plenty of scares and atmosphere to throw your way, even with the heavier action focus. I was planning on covering Dead Space 2 later in the year, but with the recent rumors about a Dead Space remake, I pushed it up in my calendar. Before we dive into the world of Dead Space 2, do note that the footage you see here is brighter than how the game looks. YouTube compression doesn't exactly play nicely with dark footage, but for best viewing experience, watching at 1440p is suggested. I won't be covering the multiplayer aspect of Dead Space 2, and I won't be covering the DLC, which wasn't released for PC. The PC version has a few little tweaks that you'll want to make in order to make the game better, like fixing the mouse controls, which I'll have linked in the description and the pinned comment if you're interested. I will be spoiling the original Dead Space, and get more into spoilers at the end of the video for Dead Space 2. I'd recommend watching my video on the original as well, which you can see here in the card. When the first Dead Space was released in October 2008, it received high praise from fans and critics, although sales were slow at first. Sales did pick up over time due to word of mouth and the strong critical reception, and Dead Space 2 was put into work. In late 2017, a former Visceral Games employee mentioned that the development budget was around $60 million, with the marketing budget around $60 million as well. To note, this tweet is now deleted. Wayback Machine didn't have anything on the thread of it. This seems to be the only source of information of how much Dead Space 2 cost to make. So how valid that number is, it's hard to say. If those numbers are correct, then it's one of the most expensive games ever made. Included in that marketing budget was the memorable Your Mom Hates Dead Space 2 campaign.
Oh my God! Oh gosh! I think it'll make a person become insane.
This game is an atrocity.
It's hard to imagine something like this being made today, and if anything, it feels like something out of the late 90s or early 2000s compared to 2011. But hey, people still remember it to this day. Not returning were Michael Condrey and Glenn Schofield, two higher-ups on the first title as they left in 2009 to found Sledgehammer Games. A number of staff from Visceral Games left as well to go work for them. Before playing, Dead Space 2 gives you the option to view a recap of the events of the first Dead Space, which is always a welcome feature. Sure, nowadays and even then, there's plenty of YouTube channels that will do so prior to a game's launch, but it's always a nice gesture when the development team puts something like this together. The game starts with Nicole talking to Isaac, and he's speaking this time around. We then cut to the present with Isaac talking to a doctor about what's happened on the Ishimura from the previous game. Kept in the hospital for 3 years, Isaac is freed during a necromorph outbreak, having no memory of the past few years, and still having hallucinations of the deceased Nicole. Knowledge that Isaac has about the marker that he encountered in the first game is being reverse engineered to create more markers. We are freed by a woman named Dana who promises rescue and a cure to remove these hallucinations. Instead of the USG Ishimura, we're on the Titan Station, a civilian space station built on the shard of Saturn's moon, Titan. In the first Dead Space, I criticized how the game was too quick in revealing the necromorphs. Here, they're revealed even quicker. However, due to the nature of Dead Space 2 and its emphasis on action, the fact that we're already familiar with necromorphs, it gets out of the way quickly and puts us in danger right off the bat, their first bit of gameplay having us running away. I feel this was the right choice instead of building up that tension.
It doesn't recognize the new junction.
I think I've got it from up here.
Or maybe it just rewired from down here.
What? I didn't hear you.
Nothing. Nothing.
One thing that we'll notice right off the bat is Isaac is now a voice beyond his screams and grunts. And this is the same voice actor from the first game, Gunnar Wright, and he does a great job with it. Now, I was a bit hesitant coming in. Isaac being a silent protagonist in the original worked well, especially in these sections where we ran into Nicole. Gave this feeling that something was really off. However, the switch to having him as a voice character was the right choice. He does have a lot more agency as a result instead of just being the errand boy sent by everyone else like in the first game. It does make for a more personal story for Isaac, and we'll get to explore in ways that would be a lot more difficult if he were still a silent protagonist. In fact, he works so well here being voiced. I'm more curious how the first title would be if he were voiced, compared to if they kept him as a silent protagonist in Dead Space 2. While still dealing heavily with the events of the first game, Isaac is determined to get through to the end. Comes across as quite likable with those we run into throughout the game that are on our side. He also knows when to shut up. He rarely talks unless he's talking to someone else. Building upon the foundation that the first game laid down, Dead Space 2 is a wonderful iteration. It fixed many of the first game's shortcomings, and adding new features that fit well with what came before. Let's look at what Dead Space 2 improved on, starting with the combat. Before we get our first gun, Dead Space 2 puts much more emphasis on kinesis usage. Whereas in the first title is mostly used to move objects or grab objects out of range, here they can be used to impale necromorphs. We can make use of limbs from dead enemies or sharp projectiles in our environment. For the most part, I didn't have an issue with trying to grab a sharp projectile as opposed to something useless out of the environment while in combat. The issue that entering an empty room with sharp projectiles lying around is a tell that necromorphs are going to pop up. While I didn't find necromorph encounters as predictable in Dead Space 2, once I picked up on this fact, it did remove some of that tension. Granted, it's not like it's the only tell, it's not like the first game didn't suffer from this as well. The greater emphasis on kinesis does make combat much more dynamic and gives you more options in battles. Sometimes guns are just not enough. Allowing us to make use of our environment when done right can really open up the possibilities for combat in a game. While it's not a super deep system by any stretch, it's a welcome addition and plays well with other options. And of course, before you know it, we'll have access to weapons like the plasma cutter and new arsenal weapons at our disposal. While I still mostly stuck with the plasma cutter, I did enjoy the javelin gun, one of the new additions to the weapon arsenal. I didn't give the Ripper much of a go in Dead Space, but I'm glad I did so here. It made some of the encounters with the smaller enemies and packs much easier, enjoyable, and gory. Dead Space 2 brings back the necromorphs you know and love to dismember from the first title, along with a few new additions. One notable aspect of combat in Dead Space 2 is just how much more mixing of necromorphs the game does. The first title tended to keep encounters to a single type of necromorph. Here, there's much more variety in what we'll encounter. This creates far more interesting combat encounters, a lot more options at hand. We have to think quicker on our feet, but we can also take advantage of some of the necromorphs. For example, those that blow up when shot can be used to take others down. There are a couple of additions of enemies and packs, one being the Crawler, reanimated infants. It's also one of the few necromorphs the game introduces behind a glass window, something that the first Dead Space made use of, whereas here, it's rarely used. The others being the pack, moving in great numbers and speed, but are taken down quickly. These require different strategies and will throw us off and keep us on our toes. But the best addition to Dead Space 2, and one of the main reasons I feel it's the better game, is the introduction of the Stalker necromorph. Not only are they the game's best enemy, they're one of the best enemy encounters I've come across in any game. Stalkers move in packs, working with one another to surround us, darting from cover to cover, before making a charge at us. The way they move, hunt, and sound are heavily influenced by velociraptors. The achievement we get for our first encounter with them is called Clever Girls, a nod to Jurassic Park. Our encounters with them play unlike any other encounter with necromorphs in the game, and complement the game mechanics that are already in place and are a wonderful addition. For them to work, the setup of the rooms we encounter them are a bit different than the norm. It becomes a fun game of cat and mouse to go from hunted to the hunt, of how the tides turn. I have to wonder how much time was put into the AI of these stalker necromorphs to get them to work the way they do. But it was time well spent. One aspect that I was hoping Dead Space 2 would improve on would be boss fights, something that the first game lacked in. Sadly, this isn't the case. Most of the bosses or mini-boss encounters are by the numbers and don't really do anything interesting. It's too bad, as Dead Space 2 greatly improves on the mechanics and options we have in combat. When it comes to bosses, it doesn't really do anything unique or interesting with them. You'd think a series that pulled such heavy influence from Resident Evil 4 would be able to create better boss battles. Granted, Western devs have always paled in comparison when it comes to designing a good boss battle compared to Japanese developers. I do want to note for this playthrough, instead of playing on normal like I did for my first Dead Space video, I played on Survivalist, the next difficulty level up. As a result, the game is much more resource intensive. I made a lot more use of stasis as well, putting heavy upgrades to it, to give some more breathing room in combat encounters. There were several times where I had to go purchase ammo from the store as it is a much less supply. Playing this way leans a lot more into the survival element as opposed to the action. So I died far more as a result. Yes, the death scenes are still excellent. although it feels like some got stretched out a bit too long compared to the first game. Playing on this higher difficulty, there were some iffy checkpoint placements that became more noticeable as a result. Sure, the game shouldn't make things a walk in the park, there were some frustrating parts that I need to replay as a result of how stretched out some of these checkpoints were. On the topic of the store, on my first playthrough, everything was moving smoothly until I opened the first door, which my immersion was utterly broken. It isn't news that EA has a reputation for a number of shenanigans throughout the years. While most of these shenanigans are not present in Dead Space 2, that wouldn't be until the next game in the series, opening the first store swarming with guns and suits that were part of the DLC that now comes with the game. To say I was upset when this happened is an understatement. One of the worst game publishing sins that have occurred over the last decade or so is not having the option to toggle these kind of things on and off. I have no idea how much these suits or weapons can break the game's balance at this point. Luckily, there is a workaround to disable all these, which just takes a couple minutes to do so. Still, the fact that there's no option in game to just disable them outright is inexcusable. Now, I understand that playing this game 10 years after launch is a little different. At the time of release, these weren't included unless you bought so separately. However, for a series like Dead Space, games that have such long shelf lives due to positive word of mouth over the years, publishers should know better that people are going to pick these games up years later on sales, and should be enabling or disabling these kind of things as easily as possible, because it left such a sour taste in my mouth. On the note of upgrades in Dead Space 2, one key addition is the respec option. We have the option of removing a node and placing it elsewhere, for a cost of 5,000 credits, which is half the cost for a power node at the store. It's a nice compromise. Perhaps the player realizes they want to invest more into a different weapon or a different path on the current weapon, but at a cost for doing so. Now that we've looked at most of the improvements made in regards to the combat, let's take a look at some of the other areas that Dead Space 2 makes improvements on. One major change is how zero gravity works. Whereas the first game has jumping from point to point, Dead Space 2 instead makes use of thrusters, allowing us to fly around instead, akin to Iron Man. While this does open up more exploration options that the game makes use of and is greatly improved from a usability perspective, I can't help but feel this change in zero-G leads to reduction in some of the immersion. Sure, zero gravity in the first Dead Space could be disorienting, and it could be hard to sometimes determine whether you could or could not jump to a surface, but it does help to replicate how I'm sure it feels to be in zero gravity, that feeling of disorientation. Here, it feels more gamey for better lack of a word, although the game does make good use of these sections as palate cleansers. I would love to see a combination of the two. Keep some of these zero-G encounters like in the first game, sections where you get to use the thrusters like in Dead Space 2. Speaking of palate cleansers, one high praise I had for the first Dead Space was the incredible pacing, which they may just have topped with Dead Space 2. There's a lot more variety of these palate cleansers that we'll encounter to give us something to do while moving from point A to point B besides combat. One of them is the addition of the hacking minigame. It's quick and simple, and a nice little addition. There's also the smart design choice of having parts where we have to be aware of necromorphs around in between hacking. They don't just wait around until we're done. There's one great bit later in the game dealing with an enemy that regenerates while trying to hack open a door. There are some basic puzzles as well, from making use of kinesis to stasis, thrusting around in zero-G. They're not head scratchers or anything, but they do help keep the flow and give us some breathing room in between combat. Another is the addition of stationary necromorphs that will take you down very quickly if you try to run by them. These sections will get you to slow down, spot them, and take care of them before progressing forward. These are all nice little additions to always keep things switching up. Developers knew just how long to make use of them before changing to something else. One of the more notable features of Dead Space was the locator system, showing us the way forward with a button press. This returns for Dead Space 2, but with the nice addition of showing where the nearest bench, store, or save point is as well. While I didn't feel it was something that was missing in the first game, it is a nice little feature to include. Another interesting aspect about Dead Space 2 is the lack of loading screens once we're in the game, instead mostly keeping things as one continuous shot. The game does pull a few more tricks to hide load screens. While the first Dead Space had loading screens with the trams in between chapters, Dead Space 2 makes greater use of elevators and the introduction of vent crawling to mask some of these load screens. We'll be notified of entering a new chapter by popping up in the bottom right corner. Until it was pointed out to me, I'm not sure I would have actually noticed that this game was one continuous shot, as it doesn't seem like a big deal was made of it. This being the case, I do appreciate the developers going the extra mile to do so. Although there is a scene later in the game where it cuts to black, and the way it happened, I thought for a second that my game glitched, but nope, that's actually the case, and was somewhat jarring. Perhaps they ran out of time?
You know I'm riding on top of this thing, right?
Ellie! 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 Ellie!
At this point, I'm going to give some thoughts about the various chapters, sections, and the plot, so this is getting more into spoiler territory. As we're on a colony, there's a lot more variety in the environments of Dead Space 2. The early section has us going through apartment areas with stores around. We get to explore an elementary school in one of the game's creepier sections. Felt like there's a missed opportunity here of not letting us into the nightclub. How cool would it have been to deal with necromorphs with some club beats playing? One of the best sections of Dead Space 2, which ends far too quickly, is the Church of Unitology. Unitology is a religion in the world of Dead Space, and it's something that the first game dabbled into. This time around we get to go a lot more deeper into it, but it's also one of the game's biggest missed opportunities. There's nice touches here about getting information about the founder and about the markers, with a pleasant appearance up front, but the further we go in, the dark underbelly of the church emerges. One thing I really enjoyed about this section that the rest of the game mostly lacks is there's a bit of looping level design. Instead of just a mostly linear route forward, we'll be doing some backtracking and open up previously locked doors so we can return to the store or bench. Oh, I couldn't help but chuckle at this one portion. The ever-growing lore of the 12-plus year legacy of everyone's favorite streamer to dunk on, Darkside Phil, this room is a notable entry in his early days that led him to getting kicked off Blip TV.
This is what happens when you let the Jews do whatever they want. You've let the Jews overrun space, and now look at this. Hello, Jew. I'm a mature adult with a business degree.
I did nothing wrong. I did everything correct.
Sadly, Dead Space 2 doesn't really do much with Unitology afterwards, because I felt like it could have been a much better antagonist than what we get. Dana, who rescues us from the beginning, betrays us. She's a Unitologist and she wants to use our knowledge to help build more markers. It's fine that after all the necromorphs we killed, it takes just 2 of her cronies to hold us in place. This could have been an ideal time to talk to Isaac behind a glass window trick that the first game loved to use. But with that, she's killed off and most aspects of the Unitologists are swept to the side. Besides the necromorphs, our main antagonist is dealing with Tideman, the highest civil authority of the station. I didn't really care for him as a villain. It's not really clear why he wants to build markers beyond some mentions in a couple of logs later in the game. Having someone like Dana and the Unitologists would have made far more sense. They want Isaac's knowledge to help build more markers. There's clear motivation there with the religion. Sadly, the game disposes of them very quickly and moves on to Tideman. Of all the issues I had with Dead Space 2, and there weren't many, this is probably the most glaring I found. While Tideman lacks as a compelling antagonist, the plot is still enjoyable in Dead Space 2 due to the other characters we'll encounter along the way. One of them being Nolan Strauss. Like Isaac, he has the knowledge in his head of what is required to build a marker. However, he's much further along in his insanity than Isaac is. His character helps serve the purpose of showing what will happen to Isaac if we don't take care of it. There are moments where he's able to hold back the insanity before it finally overtakes us, forcing us to kill him.
There you are!
Oh, Strauss, what are you doing?
You have to face her for me! Tell her I didn't mean to do it!
Strauss, it's me!
See her!
It's Isaac!
Tell her!
Strauss!
Step 3! Step 3! Oh god. Why did you...
He's a tragic character that serves his purpose well. And then there's Ellie. Ellie's a great addition to the series. Her no-nonsense attitude, her competence, her endearing accent. Seeing the way she goes from not trusting Isaac, to reluctantly trusting him, to helping us out in a pinch when she didn't need to. Watching their relationship grow is one of Dead Space 2's highlights. Her and Isaac have some great dialogue exchanges, with some good humor. It's one of the reasons I'm glad that they decided to make Isaac a voice protagonist.
Wait, you're CEC?
Heavy equipment pilot, class 4. You?
Engineer.
Nerd. Figures.
Stay ready! And take care of Strauss.
Isaac, no! This is a really bad idea.
I'll stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
I did it! I got it started. There's a lift on the other side. All good. They're swarming in through a hole in the medical deck. At least you won't have to go through there.
Unexpected obstruction ahead. Shutting down. Welcome to the medical deck.
Crap.
There's also a great justified character moment near the end of the game, where in planning their escape, Isaac launches her on the gunship, allowing her to escape, so he could deal with the marker himself. His action is justified because he wants to save her, keep her away from danger, so he doesn't have a repeat with Nicole. And Nicole casts a large shadow over Dead Space 2. After all, she was reason that Isaac wanted to be part of the crew to go investigate the Ishimura in the first game. Isaac was the one who pushed her to take the job on the Ishimura. Isaac hallucinates her later in the first game, ending with a chilly and bloody hallucination at the end, which is how we'll encounter her at various points throughout Dead Space 2. The marker makes use of Nicole to taunt him, to delve into his inner conflicts, his guilt. I should note I'm glad that they played with the game's subtitles on, because at some point she could be really hard to understand otherwise. While this isn't a psychological character study that delves to the depths compared to something like Silent Hill 2, I was pleasantly surprised by how well these sections worked and how they fit with the game, how they help flesh out Isaac as a character. One thing I appreciate about the series is how it does give personal stakes to what we're doing. Instead of just being some schmuck sent to the Ishimura, Isaac wants to go due to Nicole being on the ship. With what Isaac goes through in the first game is used to help build more markers. He's played a part in what's happened on Titan Station, even if it was against his will. And speaking of casting heavy shadows, the USG Ishimura cast a heavy shadow over Dead Space 2, and in one of the game's most notable chapters, we revisit it. Now, this section could have gone really wrong. It could have been a cheap bit of fan service, where some players would clap when they saw it, but beyond that would have nothing to offer besides cheap fan service. It also could have felt like an asset reuse, which isn't the case. There's a great bit of tension where the first few minutes aboard will have no Necromorphs around, allowing us a trip down memory lane, but also on the edge, waiting for Necromorphs to appear. We do jump around a few areas, but it doesn't feel like a case of greatest hits of the Ishimura. The section also does make some excellent cases of fucking with our memories of the Ishimura, expecting things to happen, only for them not to do so, until a later moment. For example, the decontamination room. There was so much tension building here, waiting for something to appear. The last 3 chapters or so do have a bit of a quality drop of what came before, unfortunately. I felt that the first game held its quality throughout the entire duration. It's not a huge step down by any stretch, but save for the memorable section with Isaac's eye, it didn't have quite the same punch of the previous chapters. And Isaac in that eye machine, well, people remember the scene for a good reason. Fucking it up gets you a pretty gruesome death scene. With Isaac beginning to accept that Nicole is gone, her appearance changes to guide us forward, only for quote-unquote her to betray us as we get to the marker. While interesting encounter from a visual perspective, the final boss fight is pretty lackluster, although it does have this incredible line from Isaac.
God damn it, I trusted you! Fuck you! And fuck your marker!
This line alone was worth Isaac getting voiced this time around. There's a great gotcha, looking like a downer ending with the credits rolling, only for Ellie to appear to help us escape. It's a great little moment and justified with the relationship they built between one another. It's an excellent ending sequence to an amazing game.
What?
So while Dead Space 2 received high praise, it did only sell about 4 million copies. It's funny to say only, as 4 million copies is nothing to shake a stick at. EA put a lot of money into the title, especially on the marketing side of things. So in order to justify Dead Space 3, it would need to sell at least 5 million copies, which required making a game that had a broader appeal, going more for the quote-unquote Call of Duty audience. A phrase that was tossed around a lot in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and I'm sure to this day is still used. Oh, and microtransactions. And when you try to appeal to a broader audience, more often than not, you create more issues. Dead Space 3 didn't meet sales expectations and didn't receive the same critical praise as past titles. The series was put on ice, and like so many studios under the EA umbrella, Visceral Games received the Old Yeller treatment in 2017. But if the rumors are true, and many signs point to them being so, we're going to get a remake or reimagining of Dead Space from EA Motive, a studio based out of Montreal. What's puzzling about this choice is that they're going to go for this approach as opposed to remasters. You think a company like EA would take the easy approach and just go with a remaster. And to be honest, I don't think a remake or reimagining is the way to go. These games hold up beautifully. They still look fantastic, they still play well. If you want to add the ability to quick turn, I'd appreciate it. Considering they just did the Mass Effect Trilogy remaster, I think this series could have just had the same treatment. Again, these are just rumors, but we very well may get confirmation soon enough if this is the case. And if that is the case of getting a reimagining or remake, I will do a future video giving my thoughts on it. And while I know of its reputation, I guess I should at some point finish off the Dead Space trilogy and take a look at Dead Space 3. I'll keep an eye on it during sales. So in working through this video, writing down these thoughts, I do think Dead Space 2 is the overall better game in the series. It's a wonderful sequel that builds off the original and makes various iterations to create a more enjoyable experience. While it did focus more on action, it didn't lose the horror atmosphere of the original, kept the heart and soul of what the first game had intact. The shenanigans of EA were mostly out of the way, although unfortunately, that wouldn't be the case for the next title in the series. Thanks everyone for watching, hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell. You know the whole deal with the YouTube and its wacky algorithm. If you'd like to support the channel further, please check out my Patreon. Thanks to my Tier 3 patrons here in the credits. Alright everyone, Boulder Punch out.